This is Layouts, Styles, and Themes under the hood. I'm Andrew Paulson, and I'm a software architect at FileMaker. I've been working on FileMaker for about 8 years. In that time, you can blame me for our client UI, performance, popovers, design surface, styles, themes, the inspector, the new status area, some other minor stuff. And today, thank you. Thank you very much. See, that's what I need to wake me up. Just keep doing that. So this session, we're going to cover 3 things. We're going to talk about some new layout objects and functionality in FileMaker 13. We're going to talk about styles and themes. And we're going to talk about custom styles and custom themes. After each of the sessions or sections of this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about performance, how you can use the information that I've given you to hopefully make your solutions faster and more effective. So let's dive right in. Let's talk about layout objects first. Just in general, we're going to do a quick review. Layout objects are what are stored in your database that tell us where each and every object in your layout is. It tells us what field data goes in all of them. It tells us the settings. It tells us the style. They're what we refer to as the model. Layout objects can either be standalone or they can be a container layout object. They can contain other objects. So in this diagram here, you can kind of see my example. I have a tab control. Tab controls contain panels. Panels can contain whatever they want. So when I'm talking about container object, what I mean is the container manages the visibility of its children, and they also manage the position. So if you move around an object, it'll move around all the children with it. These are not to be confused with container fields. That's a different session. I'll leave that to someone else. When you hear me say container, I'm talking about objects that have other objects inside of them. So another term I might throw around a bit is a view, or layout object view. And you don't really need to know what these are to make a FileMaker solution. You don't need to understand them to get everything to work, but understanding that they exist and what they are can help you get a handle around the performance of your solution. So when we load your layout, we create layout object views for every layout object on your layout. They allow us to do some more complex rendering and event handling. Building up these views allow us to do a lot of things faster, and they really would allow us to do the complex styling that you see in FileMaker 12 and later. But they do have a little bit of a cost, so it's good to kind of understand that they're there and understand when they're built, when they're not, and I'll go into that a little bit. So now onto the new stuff. So we have 2 new types of layout objects that we've introduced in FileMaker 13. They're both container layout objects. That is to say, they can both have children. The first one I want to talk about is a slide control. And if you understand what a tab control is and how it works, you probably understand most of how a slide control works. Slide controls, like tab controls, have different panels. You can only see one panel at a time. Instead of tabs at the top that you switch between, there's dots. And one interesting thing about slide controls is these dots can be hidden. So a trick that I've seen a lot of people use is they'll try to hide the tabs on their tab control, to use like an invisible control to switch between content on their layout by making the tab width 0 or the font size 0. You don't need to use that trick anymore. We've given you a proper first-class way to have that behavior. Use slide control, hide the dots, and you can control that slide control programmatically. You can switch between panel to panel. Now, if you do that, you're going to notice that the panels animate. So if you go from panel 1 to panel 2, you'll see it slide out and the new one slide in. That might not be what you want, so we've added a script step that allows you to control layout object animation. So kind of like freeze window, you run it at the beginning of your script, you say turn off the animations, and we'll stop doing that stuff. Another thing that's important to understand about slide controls, but also about tab controls, is we do something called lazy loading for those. When you load up your layout, we do load up all the layout objects, not just in the front tab, but in all the background tabs as well. But we don't load up any of the views. So until you switch to the second tab, we don't do all the work for bringing up that second tab. If there's a container field there, we don't need to pull down all the data for it until we actually load that tab. So you can use that to your advantage. That's all I got for slide controls. Next, I want to talk about popovers. Popovers are a new type of container object also. The data that shows in them is contextual, and I'll talk about that in a second. They also animate, and you don't really get to control explicitly where a popover is going to show up. It's more of a suggestion. So popover data, if you put a popover on your layout and you put fields in that popover, the fields will behave pretty much just like they would if you put those fields on the layout. Where things get interesting is if you put a popover button inside of a portal. At that point, all of the objects that are in the popover would behave as if they were inside of that one portal row. And this is a great technique, or a great feature that allows you to do some cool things with popovers. I've seen a lot of great things where instead of having a massive portal with lots of information in it, you can really make it a little bit more usable by putting just a few items in each portal row and then use a popover button to kind of explode out and give all the additional information that a user might occasionally want. Especially when that information is expensive. It's great to put in a popover because you can avoid paying the price for it unless the user actually needs it. So popovers position themselves they do this automatically. You get to pick whether you want the popover to show up on the left, the right, the top, or the bottom. we won't always listen to you. Popovers avoid screen edges. They'll never show half of themselves. They will avoid web viewers on some clients, and this is just kind of a limitation we've got because we can't draw stuff on top of the OS web viewer. And popovers are really interesting in another way. They'll shrink to fit if they have to. So if you define a really, really tall popover, but the user's screen size is only half that, the popover will shrink and it'll scroll. So this is one of the, I mean, aside from portals, this is one of the only other layout objects we've got that'll actually scroll around and show you your content. So not everything in a popover scrolls. So you can see this diagram here. It's a little bit washed out at the top, but an object that's in the title area of the popover will not scroll. It'll stay static. So if you need to put a button up there, a control to close the popover, that one will not scroll around, but anything that's not in the title area will scroll. You can control the size of the title area by adjusting the top padding on the popover, and you can hide it altogether if you'd like to. So now I want to talk about some new functionality. Tab controls. Another little trick we've seen a lot of people have to do is when you're creating a tab control, sometimes the tab doesn't always say the same thing. You want to be able to dynamically change the title of each of your tabs. And the standard practice, I think, now is you make the tab, you hope it's wide enough, you layer a text object on top of it, and the text object can be merge field, or you can get the dynamic content that way. In FileMaker 13, we've changed it so that you can use a calculation to specify a tab title. So these calculations are refreshed and evaluated using the same rules that we use for merge fields and other calculations. So there are some cases where we'll be able to figure out for you automatically. If you reference a field, that field value changes, we'll reevaluate your tab title. There are some other cases where we can't know, if you're using a let statement, for instance. And there is a way for you to control this explicitly, and I'll get to that in a second. Another awesome new feature in FileMaker 13 is programmatic object visibility. This allows you to take control over the visibility of any object on your layout. So by using a calculation, you can hide a specific layout object. Like I said, the calcs are, we use our dependency tree to update them automatically when we can, but we don't always, or we can't always. When you're using programmatic object visibility, we load the layout object, we load the model that comes down with the layout when it's first loaded, but we don't create the view until that object is made visible. So we don't necessarily load the data. We will, if all the rows, or if all the fields on your layout are from the same record, we do load data a record at a time, but for instance, if it's a container, and you've got a container, if you've got an image in there or a movie or something, we're not going to start loading that until you make that object visible. So for both of those objects, as I mentioned, sometimes we'll be able to update the objects automatically for you. We'll use dependencies to figure out, hey, I think this value has changed, we should reevaluate this calc. That doesn't always work. So we've always had a way for you to do this, and it's refresh window, but refresh window is really, really heavy operation. When you perform refresh window, we reload the layout. We reload all the layout objects. We tear down the views. We build them all back up again. We reload the data for the views. We reevaluate all the calcs. We reevaluate all the conditional formatting. We reevaluate everything. And that can take a long time. So refresh object is very targeted. It just does that work for one layout object, and you specify the object by name. One thing that it doesn't do that refresh window does is refresh related set. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. If you need to refresh a related set, you still have to use refresh window. So I'm sure some of you have noticed our themes in FileMaker 12 did things that you couldn't do. Our themes would put shadows on objects. Our themes would introduce padding, and they'd push in the text from the outside of the object. If you didn't like it, tough. In FileMaker 13, we've hopefully rectified that. The inspector now allows you to customize both inner and outer shadows. The inspector allows you to customize padding. And one other thing the inspector allows you to do is set a layout background. So if you have nothing selected, the inspector will now show you the information about the layout background. And usually you can't see it by default because it's behind your parts. So if your parts have a solid fill, they'll obscure the layout background. But if you were to make your parts transparent or translucent, then you'll be able to see through the layout background. And it stays static as content scrolls on top of it, which can kind of give you a cool effect. Use this wisely, though, because it's not super fast. We've done some things on FileMaker Go with hardware acceleration to make it a lot faster. And this is one of the few features that even though the iOS devices are a little bit lower powered than the desktop computers, you actually see layout backgrounds working a little bit better with them. So use it wisely. One other thing we've allowed for some objects in FileMaker 13 is subcomponent editing. And I'll talk about what a component is a little bit later when we get into styles. But for popovers, as you saw in my last slide, the popover has a title area, and there's an interior box that we call the content. So in the inspector now, you can choose, I want to edit that content area. Or for slide controls, I want to edit the way those dots look. So you can dig in and change the properties of not just the whole object, but a little part of the object. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about performance with respect to layout objects. So the first thing I want to say, layout objects carry a price. Every object you add to your layout is going to slow it down just a little bit. They all take up a little bit of data. When you're downloading your layouts, especially over slower connection, every object has bits along with it. Those have got to come down over the wire, over the air. By simplifying your layouts, you can speed things up. And we've given you a lot of tools in FileMaker 12 and 13 to reduce the number of layout objects you need to use. So by avoiding layering things, by using dynamic tab control titles, by using the new styles to avoid having to put images on top of objects, you can really reduce the number of objects. So I was looking at an old version of our DevCon to go solution, and one of the layouts had 121 objects. The new version that uses a lot of the techniques and features that we've introduced in FileMaker 12 and 13, it looks better, it has all the same functionality, half as many objects. That means it's going to load twice as fast. It means it takes up half as much space on disk. It means your user that's on an edge connection has half as much stuff to download. And that can make a real big difference. So like I was mentioning, the layout object has to be downloaded even if it's invisible. We don't do all the work for invisible objects, but there's still a cost for those invisible ones. So kind of on that same note, you can use styles to simplify. Every object can be styled. If you want to put an image in a square, you can. Buttons can have images. They can have gradients. They can have borders. You no longer need to stack things one on top of another. So the advice I give you is instead of kind of using composition to make more fancy-looking objects, try to use styles to get the same effect. You'll find that it's usually a little bit faster. So object visibility, as we alluded to, can also have an effect on performance. Objects that are off-screen, such as if you're working on a layout and you have to scroll to see some of the content. The things you haven't scrolled to yet, we don't fully set up. We set up the view, but we don't completely set it up. We don't lay out all the components. We don't evaluate the style. We don't do all the rendering. So you can get a little bit of performance benefit by just making sure not everything's on screen or keeping your layout small so not everything has to be on screen. Objects that are in inactive panels and objects that are invisible have even less cost. So we defer building these non-visible objects, these objects that are in background panels, until they're needed. So you can use that to your advantage by putting expensive and infrequently used objects in a tab panel, in a popover. And I would say that really improves usability for your solution as well. Yes?
What about objects off the right-hand side of the layout?
Same thing. If they're not visible, we don't fully set them up. So it's the same concept. They're not as cheap as an object that's in a background tab panel because we still build up the view for objects that haven't been scrolled into view, but we don't fully. So it's just partially set up. It's really quick. It doesn't have the same cost as an object that you can see. So as I was saying, I think it really makes a usability difference too. I mean, if you go and evaluate what your user's doing, if you evaluate what fields they really need to see and only show those fields, and if there's some content that they only look at 10% of the time, 5% of the time, put it on a different layout. Put it in a popover. Put it in the background of a tab control. Be careful with the tab controls. I don't want to see any of those nested tab controls like John was complaining about. But use them sparingly and use them wisely, and they can make your solutions a lot faster. I mean, so the question was, when I say cost, do I mean down the wire or do I mean clock cycles? And I mean both. There is a cost associated with bringing the information associated with a field down across the wire. So these invisible objects, if we can avoid it, we won't. That being said, when we're fetching data, we always load a row at a time. So if you have a wide table with lots of fields in it, even if we're only showing one field from that record, we download the whole record. Container fields are a little bit special. Those come down separately in piecemeal. But by and large, if you really want to save, keep your tables narrow and only show the information that you need. Oh, object visibility. I forgot to mention this when I was talking about programmatic object visibility. Not a security feature. Definitely not a security feature. If you want to prevent people from seeing data, use a security model to do it. Don't rely on programmatic object visibility.